Hey, welcome back to reading Rumblings and Remardan. And today we are on chapter 4, which is called Safety. Hobbles, are you alright? Aneptius ran back to cradling his friend's bloodied head in his hands. It didn't look so good even in the dark. The dwarf's mind was racing. He just had to get a light lit to inspect whatever damage might have been inflicted upon the young cobbler. He started to inspect around the floor on his hands and knees when suddenly there was the sound of grass being churned out in the front. Aneptius steeled his soul in anticipation of whatever this thing was to come and attack him again. This time, a blue light flashed on, and Aneptius was able to get a hold of a flimsy cobbler's tool to use as a weapon in dire straits. The dwarf held resolutely onto it, trying not to be taken by surprise again, when all went pitch black in the room. He closed his eyes for a long time there, straining his ears in the process to hear any sign of the monster returning. The change was drastically disorienting for Aneptius. He almost solely gave up on whatever strength he was trying to will up to fight this thing. Then, another light came on, this time to his soul's delight. It was the natural glow that emanated out from a torch. The steel-heeled boots clinked noisily onto the wooden porch set out front. The rain pounded down in droves. Before the soldier had noticed Hobble's prone body on the floor, he shouted, "Ho there!" Aneptius quickly dropped his loosely held club and sprung up into the torchlight, shouting back, "Ho! Groganus guides!" His soul rejoiced in the knowledge that this wasn't that terrifying creature. In the torchlight, Aneptius could make out the form of a dwarf, just around the same size as himself, which was, one could gather, the natural size for a dwarf. This dwarf had sandy blonde hair to go along with his peach fuzz of a beard, and his strikingly pale blue eyes were strangely reflected in the torchlight. He was lean, but you could see the powerful muscles from underneath his chainmail. Aneptius started laughing hysterically on seeing this person. A smile now replaced his deeply concerned and frightened frown. He ran up to embrace this fellow dwarf with a hearty hug and a cheer. "Oi! I wasn't expecting to see you here, Matthias." Matthias hugged his friend close to his chest in a drawn-out bear hug, the torch almost brushing up against Aneptius's beard. "Aneptius, Groganus is good. I didn't expect to see you in town so late." A nasal falsetto came out of this dwarf to meet him. "And I thought you were off serving the second sublime. What are you doing back here?" Aneptius asked. "Didn't you hear? A good portion, along with the prince himself, is here in Atrodnae. We sent out riders to call in anyone outside the village." Finally, the realization hit Aneptius full on that he had gotten completely carried away with following Armador's commands. "Ah, fuck. I entirely forgot about that." Their reverie together was interrupted by the second realization, this time by Matthias. The dwarf stood back, waving his torch all around the room now that he had noticed the body. He withdrew the axe slung on his belt in one deft motion and readied himself as he had trained many times for. "Aneptius, what happened to Hobbles?" The body of his friend the cobbler still lay cold on the floor, though his chest could still be seen rising with each breath, luckily. And again, Aneptius remembered all that had just occurred. "Keep out your axe, Matthias. There was some sort of creature just here." Aneptius shivered, recalling whatever this monstrosity was. He moved closer to his friend. "You should have seen this thing. It had such a body that pulled at itself, and the eyes were so enchanting, I could hardly look away. It only retreated when I said the name of our god and made the sign of the axe. It fled out the top, and that's when you came in." Matthias waved his torch about again, and readied his axe for the thing to return. His eyes quickly scanned the room back and forth, looking for anything moving to attack and take down with the muscular arms that sprang forth from his astute body. He stooped down to check the breathing of Hobbles. It had slowed, but was still steady at least. All right, I don't like the sound of that. Let's get Hobbles back to the camp and see what happened to him. Aneptius had panicked eyes again at this point. He was terrified of that monster returning. Give me your knife, Matthias. I don't want to be caught by this thing again. Matthias took out his long, thick knife from the leather belt strung at his hip and handed it to his friend. Aneptius took it and confidently made a swing with it. He had never had formal training with a weapon before, but the time swinging a hoe and axe on logs certainly made him confident. All right, you grab his legs and I'll take his head, Matthias stated deftly, trying to organize his friend into getting the cobbler out of there. Aneptius stuck the knife through his belt and took up the legs of Hobbles. The rain had slowed to a drizzle now, as the two dwarves carried their friend out of his hut. Matthias carried his torch in one hand and Hobbles' head in the other. It was rather hard for him to do, but somehow he managed to do it successfully. The village was quite quiet at this time of night. Most people had fallen asleep by then. How'd you manage to find me there, Matthias? Aneptius looked forward to where his friend was leading the way. They put me on guard duty for the town tonight. There's a couple of us doing it along with the local Reitzars. I just noticed the door was open, so I checked it out. They squashed through the new-made mud in the torchlight that spread out in front of them. They stepped deftly over the various pools that had formed since the rain had started. They passed through various parts of the village, places that had larger, full-made houses, and finally passed by the tavern that had once housed so many happy soldiers. These people were now either fallen asleep or doing their various guard duties assigned to them. The two friends carried Hobbles through the whole of the village until they came upon the crying walls of earth of the army camp there. Ho there! The rain comes fast! A sentry shouted down from the closest built-up mountain there. Matthias shouted back, The pools are filled with Groganus' cries. The freshly hewn logs of the gate swung open, revealing swiftly set up tents and a rather mannered rectangular setup within the walls. A singular human guardsman walked up bearing a torch to light their way into camp. Upon seeing the body that the two dwarves were holding, he shouted for someone to bring a medicus, and two other guards ran out carrying two logs with leather straps thrown across to make a bed where they transferred Hobbles to. The first guardsman asked, What happened to him, sir? However, Matthias looked up to reach his eyes. The man still held deference to the dwarf, even though the dwarf was so much shorter than him. Some creature got him, Robert. Let's hope the medics can do something about it. Send out several more soldiers to reinforce the men we already have out there. Yes, sir. How many more? Send out another dozen. I want every man to have at least two others by his side, and try not to wake the village. Last thing we want is Ornorian kicking us out. The guard ran away, with his pike expertly leaning on his moving body to go issue the commands that Matthias just gave him. Aneptius and Matthias headed off at a quick pace to follow the medicus on their way to bring Hobbles back to where their company Herbition was. The clink of iron was accompanied by the sounds of pattering rain and the sloshing of their boots in the now thick mud. And there was a chilly wind that hit their backs with utter gusto, making Aneptius hold his drab woolen cloak even closer, and Matthias pick up his pace even more. Aneptius saw that the camp was set up in a very organized fashion to mimic the squat and square castles that the Dvarnin lived in. Short tents spread out in every which way, he turned, as they hurried up to see how Hobbles was doing. The two entered into a rather large rectangular tent that had been dyed red, and a large circle in white was sewn into the outside of it. Several herbicians ran about, slicing ingredients and mushing them into their mortars to make a fine blend of once mixed with potato vodka. Hobbles was strewn out on another bed nearby the entrance to the tent. A couple of the medicus were attending after him and seeing all that they were able to do for him. These people were a mix of mostly gnomes and halflings, the specialist corps of the Second Sublime's Herbician team. They went about quicker than they had been before upon seeing the lieutenant walk into the room. The head Herbician came up to Matthias and said, in a rather annoyingly high-pitched voice, which immediately made the officer cringe, "What happened to him, Lieutenant? I need to know what he was attacked by if we're to help him." Matthias once again looked over to the bed which now held his downed friend, before waving him aside to Eneptius. "Ask him. He was there. Almost got attacked too." Eneptius likewise scowled when he had to deal with this halfling. The Herbician walked over and reached up to grab both his arms, and seized his chin to look into his face. While he was doing this, the Herbician said, "Feel any different? Anything hurt?" "No, everything seems fine. Head hurts a bit, but I figured that's only normal," Eneptius replied. The halfling put his short arm back on his own chin, deep in thought. "Okay, that's good at least." The halfling then walked over to his work table that was strewn with alembics and mortars, all boiling with various substances of different shapes and sizes. "Describe this monster to me," the halfling demanded of Eneptius. The dwarf thought for several moments, considering what it exactly was, and after giving up trying to identify it, he said, "It was really strange. A bunch of fingers for toes that it used to move around the house, and a huge head that had wide, saucer eyes. The teeth were what really struck me. A bunch of sharp teeth in a circle all around its mouth." The halfling doctor was intrigued. "Really? That thing certainly sounds frightening. Was there anything about it else that you noticed?" Neptius continued to think back on his terrifying encounter that almost ended him. "I looked into those eyes, and I couldn't look away or do anything. It had me spellbound, until I said the name of Groganus to help defend me from evil." The halfling's eyes lit up at the mention of this last revelation. He ran across the area of his workbench and picked out one deliciously looking green substance that continued to give off steam after he set it aside. Matthias and Eneptius continued on to watch over Hobbles, while the Herbician went through the work of distilling this new substance together with alcohols nearby. The Herbician hurried up with this substance and added in herbs like cilantro, thyme, and mint. He threw in some narcotics as well, along with a hearty mix of alcohols. "I think I know what this thing was. Here, try this," the Herbician stated. The halfling had created a ball of this substance, which now formed into a squishy little thing that he placed into Eneptius's mouth. The dwarf's eyes almost popped out of his head when the flavors hit his tongue, and the world turned to black. And that is the end to Chapter 4, Safety. So, if you liked it, like, share, subscribe. Pick up a copy of Rumblings and Remardan, or my second book, Deviations of Defiance, and look forward to my next book, one of the books about the tales across the Remardan Sea. Anyway, until next time.